This is a very exciting area, and I currently have a PhD student, Elaine Rycroft, who is actually researching children's unusual memories, so past life memories, for her topic. So it was Ian Stevenson who he was the pioneer of children and reincarnation and conducting studies mainly, all over the world in countries like India, and just capturing stories of where children had reported past life memories. But they also tried to evidence children's reports by trying to find the details of the person that the child was claiming to be in a past life, and with lots of success. So, there's lots of evidence to show that sometimes when children report these memories, it can be verified. Stevenson focused on children with particular birthmarks or birth defects who also had past life memories. And when they checked the records, they discovered that the birthmarks corresponded with the wounds that had caused the person to die. So, for example, if there was a huge birthmark on the back, it could be the shape of a gunshot wound. They checked the records and discovered that that person had been shot in the back. And how can you explain something like that? And especially, how can you explain it within a physicalist materialist paradigm? I mean, it really does raise the questions around the relationship between mind and matter. So it's a very interesting area of research.
Okay, Donna, welcome to the show. Now, to get started, can you tell me about the car crash you had at the age of 15 and the impact this had on you?
Yeah, sure. Um, so I was 15 and I was actually walking home from a youth club with some friends, and we decided to get a lift off another friend. And the weather was extremely bad, and the driver was driving far too fast. And what happened, the car, it ended up um, flipping over 4 times, smashing into a wall, and then setting on fire. And we were trapped inside. So it was quite a serious car accident. That would have been the view from the outside of the accident. But for me, something really different was happening. And as the car was turning, I felt this tremendous fear coming up just there. And this one thought inside was, I'm going to die. I'm going to die. And as soon as that thought came, I was no longer in the car. I wasn't really anywhere, which is really interesting, but I'd felt myself expand and expand, and there was a sense that I was part of everything. And it was very dark, but it wasn't frightening. It was extremely peaceful. Um, and there was this very strong sense of love. And for me, that was quite something new, because I had quite a troubled background. So I'd never really felt that kind of intense love before. And then suddenly, almost in some kind of panoramic fashion, I saw every instance of my very, very short life, because I was only 15 at the time, but didn't just see events happening, but could feel these strong emotions, and it was very, very quick. So it was kind of no time at all, but it was timeless at the same time. So there's a lot of contradictions with this, and it's very, very difficult to talk about. And when I eventually shared this with people, and I wasn't until I was nearly 40 when I started to talk about this, which is interesting. They said, "Well, it's a near-death experience," and I'd never really termed it in that way. I think simply because physically I was hurt, but it wasn't serious. I wasn't seriously physically hurt. And then suddenly I was back in the car, trapped in fear, and eventually I got pulled out of the car. And then the impact of that, I guess, is a catalyst for what leads me to do the work that I do today, really. Um, because it was very difficult to integrate such a huge experience. I mean, schools are not equipped to deal with these kinds of experiences. Nobody knows what you're talking about. If you try to explain what's happened to you in these moments, it very, very quickly gets labeled as PTSD or dissociation, without really understanding the complexities around these kinds of experiences. And I really struggled to integrate this. And for some time after, I was going to school and still having this huge sense of expansion and expanding with the sky, and not quite feeling very joyous, very peaceful too. But, as a 15-year-old girl, your friends kind of start to think, well, you're a bit weird. That's a bit weird. And when you're trying to talk about this, so integration was really, really difficult.
Wow, that must have been quite a shock to the system to experience that at 15. What was it like being a teenager and having this glimpse at a really, a deeper element to reality, but not being able to give voice to it or share it with anybody else?
Yeah. And this is the really interesting thing, because experientially, for around probably a month after the experience, I was in bed for 2 weeks, but I was still in this space of feeling this really deep peace, and this this unconditional love, and just feeling quite blissful. And it wasn't until I returned to school where then it went wrong, so to speak. And I think it was people's reactions. So, not having a space to talk about this in the way that it needs to be maybe held and talked about, and adults listening to children's experiences in that way. Um, but that wasn't available. And then I think the more that adults and peers tell you that no, that just means you're mentally ill, or that's just an effect of trauma, when your experience is telling you that it's far more. I mean, another thing that happened within that experience is that as I was more than the body, I was no longer in the car, I was expanded. Also, I was no longer a 15-year-old girl, or I didn't identify as a 15-year-old girl. So something about the self there was very different, and that was a feeling that never went away. But again, because there are no resources that a teenager, I mean, that would have been in the late 80s as well. So I think today we're a bit more fortunate, where we can log on, we can find stories like this. I think even young people now are becoming much more aware of it. But back then, there really was nothing, to support an experience like that. So I think that, combined with my really challenging childhood, my mother was an alcoholic. I was from a broken family. I think it really impacted on me, pulling away in a sense from school, and being quite rebellious, and just reacting in a way that really was negative. And then as I grew older, I didn't want the experience anymore, because it wasn't socially accepted, and just pushed it away and pushed it away and kept pushing it away, and then went into academia and pushed it away even more, in a sense, with my academic research at the time. Um, but then when I hit 40, I think experiences like this, they always kind of come back and get you. And at that point, I was going through, I think, what we'd call a dark night of the soul. And I was in a very, very bad space, a very challenging and difficult space. Um, and then the experience just kept coming back, the sensation of expanding, and it just came through again. And then it changed the whole direction, I think, of my life, but certainly the direction of the work that I was involved in.
Wow, wow. And after that had happened, did any part of you, because it was such a powerful experience, did any part of you want to return to that state of expansion, or did you just, from the age of say 15 to 40, just block this out? Was there a longing for you to get back to that
Yeah.
expanded state?
Yeah, because it was naturally there. That's the thing, following the accident, it was naturally there. And it was an attempt by me to kind of push it further and further away because it wasn't socially acceptable. Because, as a teenager, if you start to explain, well, we're not really teenagers, and, we're far more than these bodies, very quickly you just kind of get socially excluded by your peers, or they really can't understand it unless they've had this kind of experience, which I, I imagine quite a lot of young people haven't. Certainly through my own research, which I know we'll talk about later, I hear a lot about these kinds of experiences that young people have. So yeah, I mean, the longing to get there. I think the reminder, or the return to that space really did came when I couldn't push it any longer. So, going through teenagehood, moving into adulthood, having a great career in local government, becoming a mother. These are things that can distract us in a sense. And I welcomed that huge distraction from childhood, real childhood trauma, from having coming from a dysfunctional family, but B, also from being in that very traumatic experience. And I think I didn't return to it in a sense that kind of bigger I, that whatever that is, that pushed through. It kind of just pushed through, and now it's always in the background, and it's very, very welcome. It's very welcome.
Yeah, as you're speaking, it makes me think that these experiences can happen to anybody at any stage of life. There's no sort of, you don't need to have studied a certain amount or whatever. Like, these sort of awakening experiences are common across all ages, backgrounds, ethnicities, etc., etc. And if a culture lacks a language for making sense of them and integrating, then it puts the person in a very difficult position. And you hear people having these experiences and then coming out of them and thinking that they're God or these different, like, but maybe not in the right sense. They might identify as like Jesus or the Buddha or Muhammad or whatever, because that's their cultural view. So because that infrastructure is not in place, it's potentially very harmful for the people that have them, because they just don't have the language and the support there. So I was curious to ask, is there anything you wish was available to you back then that would have been really helpful? Like, best case scenario, what would have been the resources that you could have accessed to sort of help you with this?
Yeah. No, that's a really great question. Information, absolutely. Information, the knowledge that other people do have these experiences, and the knowledge that it doesn't mean that I'm broken. It just means that this is an experience that happens to many other people, young people and adults. We're not really sure when it comes to younger children, and that might be something to do with the idea that younger children may already be closer to a state of presence, let's just say for now, than young people, teenagers and adults. Um, and in research, it's really, really hard to ask questions to the younger children, say ages 3, 4, 5, 6, around these kinds of experiences. We ask them about other experiences, near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, which they have plenty of. But I think it's really tricky to talk to younger children who may not have fully been through that ego development process, where we do then get a fixed sense of self. We get a fixed sense of identity that's made up of all of our socio-cultural influences. It's much harder, but yeah, I think there are so many things that are needed, not just for these kind of NDE transcendental type experiences, but for a range of experiences that go beyond, the typical five sense sensorium that children commonly have and that children are commonly reporting. But that's a product, I think, of our social systems, which are very much rooted in the materialist, physicalist paradigm. So there's no room and to create these spaces, and we're still not there, even though all this information is available through wonderful philosophers and scientists who are coming out in a way, and talking about these matters and challenging, our dominant worldview, which is physicalist, materialist. Um, but we're not close enough yet, and it's not hitting the ground quick enough. So it's not, I don't think, reaching the public quick enough, a lot of the details and information around this. So information would have been key at that age. And, adults who understood that there might be more to this, more to this reality, more to us as just being an individual biological self operating individually in the world. But back then it wasn't available, and we still have work to do now, I think, especially with children and young people.
Yeah, I would say a big part of this is just, I suppose, making this more culturally known, because I would imagine there would be a lot of children that have these experiences even today, and their parents are just like, do not tell anybody that you've had that. That is, people are going to think you're crazy. Then they just block it out their whole lives, you know?
Yeah, and you can't blame parents for that in a sense. And we've just finished. We've completed a study that looked at these experiences across from children across various cultural contexts within the UK. Because the UK is quite culturally rich, it was an opportunity for us to try to involve children from various ethnic, cultural, and religious backgrounds. But we involved the parents as well and professionals who care for children, because we did want to kind of identify how do they respond. So if a child reports, I've heard a voice in my head, or I can hear something you can't hear, or I'm seeing a strange entity, which many, many children report this, because of the way society is structured, parents will be scared and they will naturally think straight away schizophrenia or personality disorder, or there's something wrong with my child, because we don't have them narrative resources in a way to think, well, actually there could be a middle way here, there could be something else that's happening. um, and what was really interesting about the results coming out of this study is parents do listen to children, but they're not quite sure how to advise them, which is interesting. But professionals, they really appeal to this brain based model discourse when they're presented with children, either reporting memories of past lives or having hearing voices, but it's actually a real time message for somebody that they know. So, no, these are really interesting experiences that children report. But many of the professionals, they theorize these experiences in terms of brain-based models and mental health and child development models. So again, there were no room to think outside the box and think, well, actually, is it just that? Because we don't know nearly enough about the mind, or what it does mean to be a human being. But we can very, very quickly diagnose children very too quickly. And parents, again, through fear, through conformity, through not having, again, enough information, it can be quite a fearful thing if your own child starts to demonstrate either unusual behaviours or reports to you unusual experiences.
Something I've been thinking about uh, the past couple of years, not all day every day, but just thinking about the idea of the brain almost being like a filter. That's, we've got these five senses, and this gives us access to a tiny segment of a much bigger spectrum of reality, and then filters out everything else. And then perhaps whenever you have a near death experience or you take psychedelics, there's less activity in the brain, and that actually gives you more access to a bigger reality. So when it comes to children, like, could it be that, like, seeing beings and having these experiences might be more common because that boundary is maybe a little bit more porous, and there's more coming in that like the filter isn't as developed as it might be in adults. Like any thoughts on that?
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree. And what's really interesting is that Alison Gopnik, who's a neuroscientist, but writes and talks a lot about children. Um, she thinks about the prefrontal cortex in children as mirroring um, the same states as when adults take psychedelics. So there's a decrease in activity when, or studies show that there's a decrease in activity, in brain activity when adults take psychedelics, but they still have these very rich, conscious, strange experiences. And Alison Gopnik says that that really mirrors younger children's brains, especially in the prefrontal cortex. So this is something that I mean, I'm not a neuroscientist. My research is qualitative. I'm a social scientist, but it is so worth thinking about these things, especially when we're always dealing with these brain-based models, but the models that are really kind of rooted within, again, materialist, physicalist ideas. But I think we need to widen these ideas because it could still be something to do with children's development and the brain. But like you said, Niall, it's more maybe thinking about the brain as a filter rather than a producer of consciousness that's important.
Yeah, I think that idea alone is just really worth taking time to think about. That a decrease in the activity of the brain leads to an expansion of awareness and a richer experience for the subjective experiencer. That's really worth just.
It's like the filter's not working anymore. And so if the filter's not working anymore, it's likely that you would get a fuller experience of reality, perhaps.
I guess so. It reminds me of that Jill Bolte Taylor TED talk as well, where she had the left hemisphere stroke, and she said she was just opened up to this totally different view of life. Um, you mentioned that you had your dark night of the soul around the age of 40. You'd been blocking all this out for, God, that would have been 25 years roughly. Um, was there was there a trigger for this? Did something happen, or was it just spontaneous, where it just built up and then emerged? Like, what was the circumstances around this
Yeah.
experience for you?
Well, I had a lot of difficult circumstances at the time of that. So, just the usual things like difficulties with marriage, children. I was becoming increasingly dissatisfied with the work. There was a strong sense that something wasn't right, and that feeling that no matter what I achieve or what I have, I'm not happy, and there's something missing and there's something wrong. So there was always that feeling there. I mean, that feeling was always there, but that feeling became overpowering and quite unbearable. And yeah, and I think that led to quite a significant depression, really, and just a sense of hopelessness. Um, I think to the point where at one point I didn't want to continue anymore. And, I guess teetering on the edge of feeling quite suicidal. Um, it wasn't good. And I think in the darkest moments, and I'm not going into too much detail about the life circumstances because they involve other people, and I try not to talk about other people without the permission, kind of thing. But it was just a very, very difficult time. And I think life can do this, though. I think that if you're trying to push something away and if you're trying to control situations, I think life will bring you situations that might throw you into a state of despair, so that something can crack. Because I did crack. I cracked wide open, and kind of just surrendered. And it was just there, the experience, the sensation, that deep experience of knowing and being one with just everything. And this time, in terms of integration, I just didn't even try, if that makes sense. I just let it be. I just let it be. And there was difficulties in that for around a year after, because um I wasn't great at timekeeping. I wasn't great at deadlines. I wasn't really, I kind of had one foot in this world and one foot in another world, very blissfully. There was nothing awful about that. So I guess the integration at that point was more, well, how do I balance this now? So instead of how do I get rid of it, because it's not going anywhere, and that is me. That is me, and that's not going anywhere. And so it was more of a case, well, how do I balance this? How can I do something in the world and be in the world while still sensing this and feeling this and being this? Because again, our world isn't really equipped for it. You know, we live in a society that's highly competitive, that's fast moving. It doesn't allow us time to sit back and just be. You know, we always have to be in this doing mode. So it's how can we be while having to do? So that's been the biggest challenge. That's been now the integration rather than I don't want any of this. So yeah.
I don't know why, but whenever you were sharing that story, the thing that came to mind for me was that whole, the whole prodigal son story. And in your context, it's, you're blocking this experience of that bigger awareness out for so long. You're chasing these things in the world that are going to think they're going to make you happy, and then you're gradually brought back to the source or whatever, and it's that becomes part of your life again. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah, yeah, there is an element of that, and I think that will happen to all of us because we are part of it. It is who we are, and that journey might be different for everybody. But I do believe that it is there anyway in all of us, and I don't think we need to nearly die, and I don't imagine we need to be in full crisis to be able to get to that space. I think it is there.
Yeah, I've heard people say that first it comes with like a knock and then a bang, and then if you stop that you don't listen, then it eventually
Yeah.
comes just clubs you over the head,
Yeah, that's what happened to me. I was beaten over the head, really beaten over the head, and it was very, very painful. But again, I think suffering, as awful as it is a catalyst for it. I mean, I've just said that I don't think we do need to suffer to get there because it's already there and available. But I think that suffering can really help that process. It's that idea of having to walk through the hells before you can reach the heaven. Um, and yeah, so suffering can have a productive function in a way to get you there, to beat you over the head to yeah.
And so this has happened. You're going through this really dark time, and you're coming out the other side. How does this lead to the transition then in your working life? Because I'm right in saying you were primarily a social scientist before this, and then you transitioned into working with children and particularly with consciousness studies with children.
Yeah, I've always kind of worked with children. So for around 28 years, I've always researched with children, but more from the perspectives of education, public health, and developing research methodologies to involve children effectively in any kinds of research that informs public policy. So I've always researched with children. Um, my PhD research was in linguistics, so I was really interested in looking at how we construct our identities through language, and also really interested in how discourse itself constructs social life, our social reality. What part does language and interaction play in that? And I was really comfortable there because, having gone through such a huge experience, I was really happy to find alternative explanations of reality. And for a long time, I was a social constructionist, I guess, thinking that, well, reality is just a bunch of social stuff, and we construct it through our language and through our interaction. So, but it was the focus on identity, I think, that kind of is the convergence, because the work that I do now, it is very interested in the nature of self, but self that's beyond that social construction of self, or our smaller identities, our story selves. We tell a story to ourselves about who we are. Again, that's very much made up of our social, cultural, political, influences, and we identify with that. So I think the work that I do now is a convergence of my own experiences in childhood with my earlier research on identity and language, social identity. And then I guess when I finished my PhD in 2013, I didn't go into academia. I stayed in local government because I felt I wanted the work that I was doing to make some impact with people. And I quickly realized that that wouldn't happen. All the politics and bureaucracy involved with trying to make sure, citizens have a voice in decision making. It's really challenging. And I quickly thought that this is not going to happen the way I wanted it to happen. And this was all around the time when I had kind of my third, I call it a third big experience, which is when I was around 40. So I was going through this experience, and then this experience catalyzed the change in direction. So fully accepting that this is not going away, and this is who we really are. What can I now do in terms of my own experiences, working with children, and this idea of identity, which isn't right for me, wasn't right anymore, if that makes sense. So I went back into academia and again researching with children, but the topic from children kept coming up. It always does with children. They love to talk about weird stuff. So even before we start research sessions, they'll say things like, "Oh, I had a really weird dream last night," or "Oh, I saw something really weird," or "I heard something really weird," or "I saw a UFO." So these conversations happen naturally. So it started from there. And, some of my earlier studies were just simply investigating these experiences more with children, but also integrating that with the nature of self. So, what relationship do these experiences have to how children sense their self in a way? So, when children have experiences such as premonitions or telepathy, or feeling like they are not just themselves, they are their friend, we ask them, well, who are you in that moment? And they'll say things like, well, I'm me, but I'm not just me. I'm my friend as well. We're the same in that moment. So we can see then a correlation between a shift in sense of self to kind of a transpersonal sense of self that shifted away from that social identity, from that kind of story self that we always identify with. So it all came from there, and now I guess my work has moved in a way. It still looks at these experiences, but it's very interested in altered states of consciousness in children and how, again, it's linked to these experiences, but also, what activities do children naturally engage in that might catalyze some kind of altered state of consciousness. So it could be creativity, imagination, play. These are natural activities of children. And when adults want to kind of have some of these similar kinds of experiences, they might use something called what I think it's Helena Warby. She calls gateway tools. So things such as rituals or prayer or psychedelics. So adults may need to use these to have similar experiences or be in similar states of consciousness to what children may already naturally be in. And that might link back to what we were saying about brain and brain development and the filter. So
T- Tools for turning the filter down, almost.
yeah, for sure.
I more and more, and again, I'm not basing this on anything scientific. This is just pure speculation, but good fun. I more and more, I'm starting to think that there's a creative intelligence kind of interacting with reality, very much part of reality, and it sort of sees humans. It will spot a human that could potentially be a useful, let's say, tool for the collective, for the whole. And then it will create circumstances in that person's life that gets them to do the thing that they're supposed to do, or give the gift that they're supposed to give to the world. And in your case, you seemed like you were marked out. You had three of these experiences. And what's particularly interesting is you went so far into the looking at the sense of self as being constructed by language. And when you were saying, I was like, oh my god, like that is the reality for most people. Their sense of identity is made out of these symbols, language, like bouncing around in their mind. And I was like, that's such a fragile um, concept of yourself. But what you're actually shown, that was all taken away from you. And what you're actually shown is that your sense of self is much deeper, much bigger than this this language um, construction. So I don't know, any reflections on that?
Yeah, that's a lovely idea. I mean, that's yeah, it's such a beautiful idea, and yeah, I mean, I like I land on analytical idealism in a sense because I like the idea, the field that that there's one field of subjectivity in a way that is reality, and where in some senses an expression, an experience, processes of that one field of subjectivity. Now it's I keep reaching a tricky moment with this because um, it can be described of as a sense of it just being kind of impulsive, like the movement of that field is just impulsive and it's not really self-reflective. So I always struggle with this because a part of me, I'm kind of where you are in a way that there is something where there is some kind of reflection on maybe that process or that experience or that alter might fit really well with this thing that this potentiality that needs to be expressed in the world or expressed. Um, and it's really hard to say how that process works in a way. But it is interesting how after people have these kinds of experiences, they are so transformational. And, people can do complete 360s on their belief systems in their life and the choice of partners that they have, the friends that they have. These are really transformational experiences, a lot like and near death experiences, whether they're peak experiences, whether they're huge psychedelic experiences. That the one thing they have in common, whatever you think their ontology is, they're highly transformational. So there is something playing out that it feels like there's a design in that, if that makes sense, especially when all the synchronicities come. And you think, my goodness, yes. So it's almost like you go through this awful suffering and then you think you surrender and you say, okay, I'm yours. Just let's go with whatever you want to do, no matter how uncomfortable that is. I'll do this. You get all these synchronicities and everything seems to be in this beautiful flow. Whereas before you were fighting it and it wasn't happening. So those synchronicities, it almost feels like there's some design somewhere, like you said now, behind what's happening. It's very interesting.
And I don't know, again, just coming to mind, but like, would it be fair to say that the commonality in most, if not all, of these experiences is just the letting go of the narrative self and realizing that that's fundamentally an illusion?
Yeah, I think that is, and I think that goes back to what I said earlier around it's always there and it's always accessible. So if you are someone who can do the practices of self-inquiry, for example, and be able to move into a state where you can go beyond your stories, your narratives, your thought processes, and get an experiential understanding of that awareness of that space. What we have so many words for this, and I don't think any of them might be accurate, but it's already there, and it's already available. But it all comes to the ego dissolving in a sense. So, adult psychedelic users, they describe these huge experiences and these frightening experiences where they'll go through an ego dissolution that feels very much like death. Then people will have near death experiences where they do physically die. And, you know, again, I'm involved in a study where we are investigating near death experiences with children on an intensive care unit in the UK. And we interview children 2 weeks after they've died and been resuscitated. And they also describe very similar things of, you know, I felt one with everything. I felt such deep peace. I felt such deep love. I felt like I'd gone home, which is interesting coming from a child, that idea of I feel like I've gone home. And they describe other things as well, like bedside visions. We had one child who he'd had a very serious operation and he'd died 3 times and been resuscitated. And he described he went through the tunnel, he went towards a light, so he had a classical near-death experience. But also after that, when he was recovering, he was having conversations with a bedside visitor who he described was a woman, very old-fashioned clothes, but told him that he would recover and that he would be well and he would go on to live a very successful life. Now, this young man did recover and eventually he went home from ICU. Of course, I'm not sure where he's at now, but whether that was real or not, that had an impact on his recovery because he started to recover really well from dying 3 times, resuscitation, but also undergoing a huge, huge operation. So yeah, it's fascinating. And this is why we need to involve children more in this kind of work because they can teach us so much.
For sure. And in the research into children's near-death experiences, you mentioned some of them there, but what are the common patterns that people that are being found in these experiences?
So the first thing to say about this is there isn't enough research with children directly in the near death field. So we have lots of fabulous studies on adults' near death experiences, and when you compare the research that directly involves children, so again we have a lot of research where adults are asked about their childhood experiences, but we don't have enough research that looks specifically at children and involves them and asks them about their near death experiences. So, the kind of sparse literature that's out there, the earliest study was around 1983 and it started with Melvin Morse. And it started with a case study about a 7-year-old girl who had drowned. Well, she had a near drowning event and she was taken into hospital where she reported uh, quite a big near death experience, but also she reported meeting God and going to heaven. Now, this little girl was from a religious, I think it was a Mormon background. So she'd been exposed really to these kinds of religious terms. So we might expect references to God and to heaven and these kinds of things. But she did describe the core elements of the near death experience that was kind of coined by Moody and then later Bruce Grayson with the Grayson scale, which is a sensation of leaving the body, moving through a tunnel towards the light, sometimes going to celestial places. Um, and again, studies after that from Morse in clinical context with around, I think it was 30 children in total. Again, it really shows that children do report these core experiences. Our own research that we finished last year, but that we're starting our second phase this year, in that we had 7 children. We originally had 14 children involved. We lost 7 because of the context that we're researching in, which is intensive care. So sadly, children can die or they don't recover well enough to take part. Out of the 7 children, 4 children reported elements of near-death experiences, whether moving through a tunnel, seeing a light, engaging with helpful entities, deep peace, feeling this unconditional love, and having a sense that they're far more than their childhood self. And children report this loving darkness as well. And when we kind of try to explore that with children, it's very much like they're describing a comforting womb. So it's like they're in the womb in a way. So that's really, really interesting. So that's all I can say about that so far because we do not have enough children involved. And I've actually just written a paper about this around how we need to get children off the margins of this field and start to research with them more. Um, so we can understand whether they are similar with adults. The difference as well with children is where adults can describe a kind of a story like narrative, and it can be quite chronological in a sense. So this happened and then this happened and then I was there. With children, it's a bit more sporadic. Um, and it's a bit more non-linear, and you might get an element there. So I saw a light, and then you'll get the element later. Oh yeah, I went through a tunnel. So it's a bit more fractured. But children draw pictures, so we use arts-based research methods with children because it's such a fantastic method to kind of facilitate children to represent and share their experiences that are really difficult to talk about. For adults as well, they're also difficult for adults to talk about. What Morse found in his research was that many children drew these spirals. So they're like spiral, like the tunnels. We found the same in our research, that children were drawing the spirals and the tunnel structures. We had one child who was age 6 who couldn't remember anything about her downtime. Um, so we asked her to draw a picture in the hope that she might remember something, and she also drew a spiral, which was really interesting because she couldn't remember it, she couldn't talk about it. She was very young, but she drew spirals, and it was 2 spirals, and it was exactly the same as what the older child had talked about. He went through 2 spirals, 2 structures, and he'd also drawn the 2. So there's lots to investigate. We don't really know enough yet, but it's very exciting work, and I really believe that it can maybe really contribute to ongoing investigations about the nature of consciousness, who we are, what happens when we die. And part of me thinks that if we can start to think about the question, who am I and what are we, that question, what happens when we die, might become a bit more redundant in a sense.
Yeah, the words that really stuck with me from what you were sharing there was the start. You mentioned that this sense of coming home, and they would obviously be closer to that than adults would. If you were in front of a board and you were trying to make the case for why we need to allocate as much funding as possible into research into consciousness studies with children, what would you be saying? What would you say is this is why we need to do this and allocate the resources?
Yeah, I think children are an excellent research population because it's quite raw with children. They're not nearly as conditioned as um, younger people and adults. So there's something purer about. So an example is children have or report core features of an NDE. Now, an adult can report core features of an NDE, but there's always that chance that, and a bigger chance now because we're exposed to so much information, adults could have read as well about the core elements of an NDE. It's far less likely that children have any knowledge about the features of a core NDE, but yet they still report them. So, where does that report come from? It's more likely to have come from direct experiencing rather than conditioning or something conceptual in a sense. So I'm kind of making the case now in a way for why I think children might be one of the most important research populations for when we're trying to think about the nature of consciousness, the nature of self. Where are we before we start to develop egos? Before we start to get a real sense of social identity, before we're exposed, and we construct, we construct and we co-construct our social identities. We appropriate ideas from these institutions and bigger narratives about the world and about who we are, but we're also colonized by them as well. So we're significantly influenced by them. But that's a process, and I think that's something that happens as we go along chronologically in age. But again, children are less exposed to that. I'm not saying children are not exposed, and I think one of the dangers now is that children are overexposed to things. Children have access to the internet, to iPads, and they can have access to certain kinds of knowledges, but how that's processed and what their interests are, again, I still think are going to be different from how an adult would perceive or cognize the world, cognize their experiences. So yeah, they're very important, and we do need funding. I mean, that's one of the other issues, is that in academia is a difficult space to do this. We have to fight for ethical approvals. We have to legitimize and make cases for why this work is really important. One of the biggest things is the children's mental health crisis, for example. Many children are diagnosed, misdiagnosed, quickly diagnosed, um, with very similar experiences that are known as psychotic like experiences. And that's interesting in and of itself. So, there's lots of studies in child psychiatry that show children in non clinical populations can report something called psychotic like experiences. So, these are not clinical and they're just under the diagnostic criteria, so they can't be diagnosed, but they're still having these strange experiences, but immediately they're framed within mental health discourses. So immediately they're psychotic, but we don't know what they are. And they're very similar to the extrasensory experiences that children in our studies are reporting. And children certainly don't see them as mental health issues. They just, for younger children, they think that this happens to everybody. There's nothing, unusual about seeing someone at the end of my bed, or, whatever their experience is. It's not unusual. It happens to everybody, whether it's imaginary companions or so. Yeah.
It's it's really telling that these experiences are labeled as psychotic, like in a materialist culture, a materialist paradigm. Anything that fits or doesn't fit into those maps is labeled as psychotic or whatever, and that's just, I think that's so harmful. When I was doing some prep for this, I heard you say in another interview, and this might be wrong, but it was something along the lines of there being a correlation between birthmarks and uh, past life memories. Is there something there, or am I getting that wrong?
Yeah, no, that's correct. That's absolutely correct. Um, yes, this is a very exciting area, and I currently have a PhD student, Elaine Rycroft, who is actually researching children's unusual memories, so past life memories, for her topic. And we were just having a conversation about this. So it was Ian Stevenson who he was the pioneer of children and reincarnation, and conducting studies mainly, all over the world, in countries like India, and just capturing stories of where children had reported past life memories, but also, Ian Stevenson and his kind of predecessors, which was, I think it's Jim Tucker and the team at the University of Virginia. They're continuing with this work, but they also try to evidence children's reports by trying to find the details of the person that the child was claiming to be in a past life, and with lots of success. So, there's lots of evidence to show that sometimes when children report these memories, it can be verified. So it's actually verifying children's memories, which is really interesting. But Stevenson focused on children with particular birthmarks or birth defects who also had past life memories. And when they checked the records, they discovered that the birthmarks corresponded with the wounds that had caused the person to die. So, for example, if there was a huge birthmark on the back, it could be the shape of a gunshot wound. They checked the records and discovered that that person had been shot in the back. And that's just fascinating. And how can you explain something like that? And especially, how can you explain it within a physicalist materialist paradigm? I mean, it really does raise the questions around the relationship between mind and matter. So it's a very interesting area of research.
That's mind blowing. What sort of sample sizes are we talking about here? Like, this is obviously not huge, but what kind of numbers roughly?
I'm not sure for the birthmark research, but they've got thousands of cases at the University of Virginia, which is where Stevenson was originally based. In fact, I think he may have set up that research department. They've got a fantastic team there, but I do believe that there's thousands of case studies that evidence children's past life memories.
This is fascinating. So, is there anything else before we wrap up, Donna, that I haven't asked you about today that you feel would be important to share before we finish?
I think now that we've touched on all the really important points, I think for any parents who are listening, just to know that if your children do start to report unusual things, it's okay to just really deeply listen and say that it's okay. And lots of other children have these experiences. So if that's helpful to anyone who might be listening.
Thank you, Donna. Well, I've enjoyed every minute of this. This has been really, really interesting. Thank you for taking the time. Where can people learn more about your work online? Can you tell us about your book and where they can get that, and anything else anywhere else that you'd like to send people?
Yeah, sure. I don't have a website at the moment, but I do have quite a few published academic papers. I don't have the names for them with me at the minute. Um, I have my book, which is Children's Unexplained Experiences in a Post-Materialist World. That's available on Amazon. It's Essential Books. It has a beautiful foreword by Bernardo Castro. Um, and also another book that's just come out, which is Self and Subjectivity in Social Research. And that really digs into the idea that we might be more than this biological machine, and that we need to start thinking about these ideas when we're researching with people.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, I'm glad in the grand scheme of things that you did have your dark night of the soul, because it's led to such brilliant and impactful work that you're doing now. So I want to wish you the best going forward, and I hope we can reconnect at some point in the
Oh,
future as
yeah.
well.
Thank you so much, Niall. It's been fantastic conversation. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. If you enjoyed this episode, you might also enjoy getting our 7 Insights newsletter. This is a once per month email where I share 7 of the most valuable insights I've uncovered in the previous 30 days. It includes book, podcast, and documentary recommendations, as well as questions and quotes specifically curated to help you live a more creative, intentional, and meaningful life. It currently goes out to over 50,000 subscribers each month. And if you're interested in joining them, you can sign up via the link in the description.